Okay, we're going to begin this module with lesson 26. And this lesson is sort of a collection of topics that don't necessarily fit with other lessons, but all have to do with money and banking. And so I wanted to start with a module that just kind of collects all three of these ideas. So we'll actually be doing three distinct topics in this unit. Okay, the first topic is what's called the time value of money. And that, by definition, just simply means this. It's the principle that money has more value today than it does in the future. And I think if we all sort of think about that, that makes sense. If I came up to you and said, hey, would you like your money now or your money in the future? Most of us would say now. Maybe just to illustrate, let's look at an example. $105 in 1 year would be needed to replace $100 today. Or saying that backwards, if I offered you $100 today, the only way you would agree to wait 1 year was if I instead offered you $105 later on. And why is that? Because there is a cost to us waiting to use money. We would rather have our money now and spend it now. We'd rather have our house or our car or whatever it is now rather than having to wait to get that money. So if we're going to ask somebody to hang on to money and wait to spend it, then we have to give them something. And the answer to that thing, we know already what it is, which is interest or an interest rate. So in this case, we're assuming that this person is expecting at least 5% interest for being willing to wait till the end of the year for their money. Another way of thinking about this is this. In 30 years, that same $100 might grow to over $1,000. So if you were to offer someone $100 today or $500 30 years from now, they might very well take the $100 today. Now that would, on its face value, might seem silly. Why would they take the $100 today and let $500 go? Well, because they understand the time value of money, that having money now is more important than having it in the future. And because of interest, that money could, if we hang on to it, grow to almost $1,000. So if we only offer $500, there's really no reason for someone to wait for that money. So here's a summary of this topic, and this is a pretty straightforward concept. Money is worth more now than it is in the future. Now here's the real key point. The lower interest rates are, the more money is valuable now than it would be in the future. And again, to see if that makes sense, if I said to someone, you have $100 right now, but the interest rate is only 2%. So if you wait a year and don't spend that money, you're getting $102. Somebody might say, you know what, that $100 is really worth it to spend right now. But if I said to you the interest rate was 10% of the year, and you're going to get $110 back in a year, more people might say, you know what, that $100 is nice and I would love to spend it right now, but it's worth hanging on to. So the key thing that determines, or one of the key things that determines how valuable money is right now, is how high interest rates are. The lower they are, the more money is valuable now. The higher they are, the more likely people are to be willing to hold on to it. Again, just to summarize, or as interest rates decrease, the present value of money increases. Okay, topic number 2 is what are called financial assets. This is a term that we haven't used explicitly, though we have talked about some of the things in this category already. Let's start by defining what a financial asset actually is. It is something intangible that gets its value from an agreement between the seller and the buyer. The key word in this sentence really is intangible. The things that we're talking about here don't have value in and of themselves, but because the buyer and the seller have made an agreement that this thing is valuable, essentially it has value. Now, what kind of things are like that? Well, something, for example, like a stock. A stock, that piece of paper, doesn't really have any value. The only reason it does have value is because someone who's selling it, in this case, a company, and someone who's buying it, in this case, a shareholder or a share investor, agree that it has some value. This company has value and this piece of paper represents that company. Now, what is a stock? A stock is simply a share of a company or a small piece of a company. When you buy a stock, you actually become a partial owner of that company. Another common example of a financial asset, which we're going to talk about a lot more in this class, is what's called a bond. And now we've talked about bonds a little bit already, but essentially, again, a reminder, a bond is a loan to the government or a business with a fixed interest rate and a date of maturity. And that term, by the way, maturity, I put in parentheses, is when the loan comes due. So for example, if you have a 10-year bond that you bought in 2010, the date of maturity would be 2020. Okay, these are two good examples of financial assets. And again, bonds are the ones we're going to use most commonly throughout the course of this lesson. One other one that's just worth mentioning, though probably not on the exam, I can't let you get through an economics course and not know this term, especially today, and that term is mutual fund. For most people who are investing for their future, the reality is that buying individual stocks and bonds is often not a good idea because, frankly, the average person just isn't well versed enough in which stocks are the best ones to buy and which bonds are the best ones to buy. So a good option for a lot of folks is what's called a mutual fund. And that's just essentially a bunch of stocks and bonds mixed together that somebody who does this thing professionally figured was a good mix and was put together for you. So those are the three examples of financial assets. Again, bonds is the one that we're going to focus on in this particular lesson. Okay, so let's take a look at how bonds are priced. This gets a little bit tricky, so stay with me. Okay, first, here's the rule, and ultimately this is what you really need to know, though I'd like you to understand why it is when it's all said and done. First, here's the rule. As interest rates rise, bond prices decrease. Okay, now as interest rates rise, the price of a bond decreases. Now remember what bonds are. Bonds are essentially IOUs. They're loans that you give to someone, often the government, and the government says essentially, okay, I'm going to take your money. I'm going to pay you back that money eventually with interest, and I'm going to do it in a certain amount of time. So how the heck do interest rates changing affect bond prices? Probably giving an illustration is the best way to do it. So let's take our friend Joe here. Suppose Joe buys a $100 bond for $95 and it matures in 1 year. 1 year bonds are not uncommon. So let's go that again. Joe buys a $100 bond for $95 and it matures in 1 year, or it gets paid back in 1 year. Now, that means essentially that right now Joe is expecting an interest return of about 5%. A little bit more actually. All right, now, instead, suppose Joe decides to sell that bond to Sam. Now, why would Joe do that? There's lots of reasons Joe might do that. Joe might not want to have his $95 tied up anymore, or he might need that money quicker. We don't know why Joe might sell it, but there's lots of reasons he would. Suppose he does, though, decide to sell that bond to Sam. Now, in the end, remember, that $100 is all that Joe or Sam is going to get back. However, in the meantime, interest rates have risen to 10%. So think about that. If the interest rates have risen to 10%, now Sam can do one of two things. Either he can buy Joe's bond, which is only getting a 5% return, or he can spend it on something else that's getting that 10% return. The reality is it wouldn't make sense for Sam to buy Joe's bond unless Joe did something. Unless Joe said, okay, you know what? I'm not going to sell that bond for $95. Maybe instead I'll sell it for $90 or $91. Now Sam is getting about 10% because remember that $100 that they get back when it matures stays the same. So now Sam might say, okay, if I only have to pay you $90 or $91 for this bond, maybe I'll make it work. So the idea is that the more interest that's available to people, where they could spend their money in other places or invest their money in other places, in reality, they might say then, okay, I'm not willing to pay as much for those bonds that are already out there. Again, the rule is as interest rates rise, bond prices decrease. And of course, the opposite, as interest rates decrease, bond prices increase. Generally speaking, the AP exam is not asked for a detailed explanation of why that is. But This is a good little summary, and hopefully it's worth at least having some background understanding that. Okay. By the way, my answer there to my question, which I asked, was no more than $90 because, again, Sam wants to get at least 10% for his money because he knows he can get that 10% somewhere else. Okay, and the last topic in this lesson is what's called the quantity theory of money. And the quantity theory goes like this. It's the theory that the growth of money, remember what we call money in this class, M1, is the primary thing that determines the inflation rate. Now, if that's true, there's an equation that goes along with it, and that equation is MV equals PY, or sometimes you'll see it written as MV equals PQ. Okay, let's stop here and take a look for a second at what we're thinking here. The definition of this theory, again, is that the growth of money, M1, is the primary thing that determines the inflation rate. So essentially, what people who believe in the quantity theory say is that the amount of money circulating in the economy is the main thing driving M1. Now, to understand why that is, it's definitely worth looking at this equation. M1 times, by the way, what this stands for, M1 times velocity, or the V, is equal to the P, price level, times the Y, RGDP. And we've used Y already as a symbol for RGDP. M1 times velocity is equal to the price level times RGDP. Well, what in the world is velocity? We sort of need to know that. So let's define that term next. Velocity is the number of times money changes hands. Now, when you think about this equation actually sort of makes pretty good sense right on its face. But I think an example is probably going to help us understand the best. So let's take a very simple economy. Suppose we have an economy that can produce 10 hamburgers, and the price of each burger is $4, and there is $20 in the money supply. Okay, so let's get this straight. We're producing 10 hamburgers, so our RGDP is 10 hamburgers. The price of each burger is $4. Now, since we're only producing one item, that means our price level is $4. So the right side of the equation is, right now, 4 times 10, or $40 worth of hamburgers. And there's $20 in the money supply. There's $20 in cash. If we want to consume all $40 worth of hamburgers, how many times must the money change hands, or what must be the velocity of money? Well, we have $20 and there are $40 worth of burgers. So if we again think about MV equals PQ, we realize that $20 times some amount of velocity must equal 4 times 10. And therefore the velocity in this case is 2. So the issue really is that this equation certainly does make a great deal of sense. How does all of this, however, relate back to that original theory? The theory that the growth of money, the M in the equation, is the primary thing that determines the inflation rate, or the P in the equation, the price level. Well, here's how. By the way, before we get to that, I do want to give you one example of actually using this equation. So here we go. So suppose an economy makes only footballs. Each football sells for $20, and the economy has the ability to produce 5 footballs. If there is $10 in the money supply, how many times will that money change hands to consume all 5 balls? Stop the recording here and try the equation for yourself. Okay, just to summarize, we have $20 in the economy, we have $20 in M1, we want to consume, the footballs sell for $20, and there are 5 footballs that can be produced. There's also $10 in the economy. Okay, so again, looking at our equation again, MV equals PY. We can tell from the problem that the right side of the equation, P, is $20, since the footballs are all $20, and we can produce 5 of them, Y. So P times Y on the right side is going to be 20 times 5. And on the left side, again, it looks like we're trying to find velocity. So we already know that there is $10 in the money supply. So I think it sets up like this. $10 times the velocity is equal to 20 times 5, which is equal to 100. And with a little bit of algebraic manipulation, we find out that 10 times v times the velocity is equal to 100, and so therefore v is actually equal to 10. Okay, let's summarize this last topic. To do that, we need to make sure that we understand why monetary theorists believe this theory makes sense. And the reason is because of an assumption they have about this formula. And that assumption is the following: that v, the velocity of money, or the number of times it changes hands, and y, the RGDP, are essentially constant. It's not really worth in this course yet getting into why that is. It's really the underlying belief of people who believe in the quantity theory, that velocity doesn't really change much, and our ability to change RGDP isn't all that great either. And if that's really true, now again, that's one of the points that economists often debate, but if you fall into this camp, you believe that that is essentially true. And if that's true, then the formula certainly says something very important. It says that essentially, therefore, if we kind of knock v and y out of the way because they never change, it means that m, or any change in m, has to very directly lead to changes in P, or changes in M1 directly lead to changes in inflation. And again, that's what the people who believe in the quantity theory of money believe. Again, let's illustrate with an example. Let's lay out all our information here. If M is $10, V is 10, our price level is 20, and our RGDP is 5, and this is our example we used before, what's true? Well, if M increases, or doubles in this case, to 20, and again, we're assuming v and y are constant, what happens to P? Well, if m doubles, and again, here's our formula, if m doubles to 20, we now have this situation. 20 times 10, or 200, must equal P times 5, which therefore means P is equal to 40, and it also doubled. And according to the quantity theory, that makes sense, because what does the quantity theory say? The quantity theory says that changes in M1 directly affect changes in inflation. Or in other words, another way of thinking about this is that monetary policy is the most important thing for affecting price level, because M1 is affected by monetary policy. Now, there is a whole group of economists who believe this theory, and we should meet them for just a second. They're called the monetarists. And again, these are essentially economists that subscribe to the quantity theory of money, that manipulating the money supply is a powerful and important thing in determining the economy. By the way, generally speaking, we don't learn specifically about economists, and I'm sure there aren't going to be specific questions related to the name Milton Friedman, but it is at least worth mentioning. If you're going to know any economists in this class, there are just a handful that I would recommend really knowing, and one of them is this gentleman, Milton Friedman. He is sort of the giant of the monetarists. He just passed away a few years ago, and his quote there sort of sums up what Milton Friedman and the monetarists believe. The quantity theory, that inflation, as he said, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. In other words, inflation occurs because of changes in money. Okay, so in this lesson, we talked about financial assets, we talked about the quantity theory of money, and we talked about the time value of money. Again, none of these topics in and of themselves will tie greatly into other lessons, but they are all related to money and banking, and so this was a good lesson to try to get all of that in.